So here we go. We finished up chapters 1 and 2. We'll be starting chapter 3 and 4. So continuing on with the story. The lighting gets a little more dark as we move into this. So here we go. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it necessary for the completion of my education that I should be made acquainted with the other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the date resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. So make a note of this. How did he end up where he was? It's the book and those authors, then that's reversed by the lightning, and now something else happens here. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever. Her illness was severe, and she was in the greatest danger. During her illness, many arguments had been made to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that the life of her favorite was menaced, she could no longer control her anxiety. She attended her sickbed. Her watchful attentions triumphed over the malignity of the distemper. Elizabeth was saved, but the consequences of this imprudence were fatal to her preserver. On the third day, my mother sickened. Her fever was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the looks of her medical attendants prognosticated the worst event. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you. And happy and beloved as I have been, it is not hard to quit you all. But these are not the thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." Last words of his mother. She wants what? Victor and Elizabeth to be married. Seems strange to us, but not to them. After all, not really brother and sister per se. She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection, even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she whom we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared a part of our own, can have departed forever. That the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. Wow, that's some powerful thoughts. Mary Shelley's reflecting on that, because in her own life, there had been numerous deaths preceding the writing of this. And remember, she's writing this as an 18-year-old. Victor's 17. What's his motive? Again, he wants to banish disease. Had he been able to banish disease, his mother wouldn't have died. His sister wouldn't have been sick. And so now he has that resolve once again. But look at that. I mean, just that writing right there is so accurate of one who's been taken from somebody else, one that you feel greatly about. Never more to be heard. Wow. These are the reflections of the first days. But when the lapse of time proves the reality of the evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not that rude hand rent away some dear connection, especially now in light of what's happening in the world with coronavirus, COVID-19? And why should I describe a sorrow which all have felt and must feel, right? Part of the human condition. We're all going to experience this at some point. The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, and the smile that plays upon the lips, although it may be deemed a sacrilege, is not vanished. My mother was dead, but we had still duties which we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest and learn to think ourselves fortunate whilst one remains whom the spoiler has not seized. In other words, life must go on. My departure for Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained for my father a respite of some weeks. It appeared to me sacrilege so soon to leave the repose akin to death of the house of mourning and to rush into the thick of life. I was new to sorrow, but it did not the less alarm me. I was unwilling to quit the sight of those that remained to me, and above all, I desired to see my sweet Elizabeth in some degree consoled. I'll adjust the lighting here. Come on. Hold on a minute. Keep this lighting going. There we go. All right. She indeed veiled her grief and strove to act as the comforter to us all. She looked steadily on life and assumed its duties with courage and zeal. She devoted herself to those whom she had been taught to call her uncle and cousins. Never was she so enchanting as at this time. When she recalled the sunshine of her smiles and spent them upon us, she forgot even her own regret in her endeavors to make us forget. The day of my departure at length arrived. Clerval spent the last evening with us. He had endeavored to persuade his father to permit him to accompany me and to become my fellow student, but in vain. His father was a narrow-minded trader and saw idleness and ruin in the aspirations and ambitions of his son. Henry deeply felt the misfortune of being debarred from a liberal education. He said little, but when I spoke, I read in his kindling eye and in his animated glance a restrained but firm resolve not to be chained to the miserable details of commerce. So he doesn't want to be like his dad. He wanted to go with Victor, but his dad was like, you don't need to educate. You can go to college. You can just do what I do. You'll grow up to be a merchant like me. We sat late. We could not tear ourselves away from each other, nor persuade ourselves to say the word farewell. It was said, and we retired under the pretense of seeking repose, each fancying that the other was deceived. But when at morning's dawn I descended to the carriage, which was to convey me away, they were all there. My father again to bless me, Clerval to press my hand once more, my Elizabeth to renew her entreaties that I would write often and to bestow the last feminine attentions on her playmate and friend. Yes, experience. I threw myself into the chaise that was to convey me away and indulged in the most melancholy reflections. I, who had ever been surrounded by amiable companions, continually engaged in endeavoring to bestow mutual pleasure, I was now alone. In the university whither I was going, I must form my own friends and be my own protector. That's a key line. What's going to happen in the future. So again, write that down. Victor, at age 17, is alone and has to learn to form his own friends and be his own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance to new countenances. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey, but as I proceeded, my spirits and hopes rose. I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain during my youth cooped up in one place, and had longed to enter the world and take my station among other human beings. Now my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. I had sufficient leisure for these and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. At length the high white steeple of the town met my eyes. I alighted and was conducted to my solitary apartment to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction and paid a visit to some of the principal professors. Chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted omnipotent sway over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps from my father's door. Key line right there. Again, it's not him, the angel of destruction. Something evil is at work here. Something has taken over his life and he cannot avert it, he cannot escape from it. Led me first to Monsieur Krempe, professor of natural philosophy. He was an uncouth man, but deeply imbued in the secrets of his science. He asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science appertaining to natural philosophy, aka chemistry. I replied carelessly and partly in contempt, mentioned the names of my alchemists as the principal authors I had studied. The professor stared. Have you? He said. Really spent your time in studying such nonsense? I replied in the affirmative. Every minute, continued Master Krempe with warmth. Every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory and exploded systems in useless names. Good God! In what desert land have you lived, where no one is kind enough to inform you that these fancies which you have so greedily imbibed are 1,000 years old and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew. So saying, he stepped aside and wrote down a list of several books treating of natural philosophy which he desired me to procure, and dismissed me after mentioning that in the beginning of the following week he intended to commence a course of lectures upon natural philosophy and its general relations, and that Master Waldman, a fellow professor, would lecture upon chemistry the alternate days that he omitted. I returned home not disappointed, for I have said that I had long considered those authors useless, whom the professor reprobated, but I returned not at all the more inclined to recur to these studies in a shape. Master Krempe was a little squat man with a gruff voice and repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not prepossess me in favor of his pursuits. In rather a too philosophical and connected a strain, perhaps I have given an account of the conclusions I have come to concerning them in my early years. As a child, I had been content with the results promised by the modern professors of natural science, with a confusion of ideas only to be accounted for by my extreme youth and my want of a guide on such matters. I had retrod the steps of knowledge along the paths of time, and exchanged the discoveries of recent inquirers for the dreams of forgotten alchemists. Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was very different when the masters of the science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene was changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions on which my interest in science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. Such were my reflections during the first 2 or 3 days of my residence at Ingolstadt, which were chiefly spent in becoming acquainted with the localities and the principal residents in my new abode. But as the ensuing week commenced, I thought of the information which Master Krempe had given me concerning the lectures, and although I could not consent to go and hear the little conceited fellow deliver sentences out of the pulpit, I recollected what he had said of Master Waldman, whom I had never seen, as had hitherto been out of town. So what Victor's doing here with Walton is he's establishing his ethos, his credibility, that if the story later becomes too fantastic or hard to believe, he gives the names of people, describes the city where he studied, and is building the background to make this sound real. And for the readers of Mary Shelley, this all seems very possible, then plausible that, as we know later, this creature. So it goes on. Partly from curiosity and partly from idleness, I went into the lecturing room, which Master Waldman entered shortly after. This professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared about 50 years of age, but with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. His person was short, but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I had ever heard. He began his lecture by a recapitulation of the history of chemistry and the various improvements made by different men of learning, pronouncing with fervor the names of the most distinguished discoverers. He then took a cursory view of the present state of the science and explained many of its elementary terms. After having made a few preparatory experiments, he concluded with a panegyric upon modern chemistry, the terms which I shall never forget. Key points here. The ancient teachers of this science, he said, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. Such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such the words of the fate announced to destroy me. As he went on, I felt as if my soul were grappling with a palpable enemy. One by one, the various keys were touched which formed the mechanism of my being. Chord after chord was sounded, and soon my mind was filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much has been done, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. More, far more will I achieve, treading in the steps already marked. I will pioneer a new way, exploring unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. That becomes his motive. At that moment, having met that guy, he revows again to do what he must do to bring to life and banish disease and destruction. I closed not my eyes that night. My internal being was in a state of insurrection and turmoil. I felt that order would thence arise, but I had no power to produce it. By degrees, after the morning's dawn, sleep came. I awoke, and my yesternight's thoughts were as a dream. There only remained a resolution to return to my ancient studies and devote myself to a science for which I had believed myself to possess a natural talent. On the same day, I paid Master Waldman a visit. His manners in private were even more mild and attractive than in public, for there was a certain dignity in his mien during his lecture, which in his own house was replaced by the greatest affability and kindness. I gave him pretty nearly the same account of my former pursuits as I had given his fellow professor. He heard with attention the little narration concerning my studies and smiled at the names of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, but without the contempt that Master Krempe had exhibited. He said that those were men whose infatigable zeal modern philosophers were indebted for most of the foundations of their knowledge. They had left us an easier task, to give new names and arrange in connected classifications the facts which they, in a great degree, had been the instruments of bringing to light. The labors of men of genius, however erroneously directed, scarcely ever fail in ultimately turning to the solid advantage of mankind. I listened to his statement, which was delivered without presumption or affection, and then added that his lecture had removed my prejudice against modern chemists. I expressed myself in measured terms, with the modesty and deference due from a youth to his instructor, without letting escape. Inexperience in life would have made me ashamed of any of the enthusiasm which stimulated my intended labors. I requested his advice concerning the books I ought to procure. I am happy, said Master Waldman, to have gained a disciple, and if your application equals your ability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is that branch of natural philosophy in which the greatest improvements have been and may be made. It is on that account that I have made my peculiar study, but at the same time I have not neglected the other branches of science. A man would make a very sorry chemist if he attended to that department of human knowledge alone. If your wish is to become really a man of science, and not merely a petty experimentalist, I should advise you to apply to every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics. So we see there this idea, too, that chemistry, they recognized then as being one of the great things that will improve the world. But not a chemist alone. One must be well-rounded and know the other things. Thus, we have today biochemistry and other forms of chemistry that deal with different levels and degrees. He took me into his laboratory and explained to me the uses of his various machines, instructed me as to what I ought to procure, and promising me the use of his own when I should have advanced far enough in the science not to derange their mechanisms. He also gave me a list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. Thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny. It's a key point. Continuing on, chapter 4. From this day, natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry, in the most comprehensive sense of the terms, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardor those works, so full of genius and discrimination, which modern inquirers have written on these subjects. I attended the lectures and cultivated the acquaintance of the men of science of the university, and I found even in Master Krempe a great deal of sound sense and real information, combined, it is true, with a repulsive physiognomy and manners, but not on that account the less valuable. And Master Waldman I found a true friend. His gentleness was never tinged by dogmatism, and his instructions were given with an air of frankness and good nature that banished every idea of pedantry. In 1,000 ways he smoothed for me the path of knowledge, and made the most abstruse inquiries clear and facile in my apprehension. My application was at first fluctuating and uncertain. It gained strength as I proceeded, and soon became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of morning, whilst I yet engaged in my laboratory. So, he's an introvert, and he finds a friend in that scientist Waldman. The other guy, he has information, but he's just not as interested in him. He's staying up all night, going to class during the day and at night doing experiments. All sleep and no play. Eesh. We'll see where this goes. As I applied so closely, it may be easily conceived that my progress was rapid. My ardor was indeed the astonishment of the students, and my proficiency that of the masters. Professor Krempe often asked me with a sly smile how Cornelius Agrippa went on, whilst Master Waldman expressed the most heartfelt exultation in my progress. 2 years passed, so he's now 19. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but was engaged heart and soul in the pursuit of some discoveries which I hoped to make. None but those who have experienced them can conceive of the enticements of science. In other studies, you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit, there is a continual food for discovery and wonder. A mind of moderate capacity, which closely pursues one study, must infallibly arrive at great proficiency in that study. And I, who continually sought the attainment of one object of pursuit, and was solely wrapped up in this, improved so rapidly, that at the end of 2 years, I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me great esteem and admiration at the university. When I had arrived at this point, and had become as well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy as depended on the lessons of any of the professors at Ingolstadt, my residence there being no longer conducive to my improvements, I thought of returning to my friends and my native town, when an incident happened that protracted my stay. So, he is exceptional. He is a great student. He's even made what we would have today patented discoveries and improvements, and he knows as much as they know. It's time for him to move on, to go somewhere else. And once again, something is going to change his fate. One of the phenomena which peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame, and indeed any animal endued with life. Whence, I often asked myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has ever been considered as a mystery. Yet, with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted, if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries, right? That's a key line. You need to underline it. Cowardness, fear, or carelessness stops us from pursuing that. And he wants to know, where does life come from? If you're going to banish disease and death, you must know where it comes from. You have to know where life comes from in order to conquer that other which takes it. I resolved these circumstances in my mind and determined thenceforth to apply myself more particularly to those branches of natural philosophy which relate to physiology. Unless I'd been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to the study would have been irksome and almost intolerable. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. See, right there. highlighted. It's right there. Again, you need to understand that. If you're going to solve a problem, you need to know the cause in order to solve it. What is the thing that brings it about? And so in order to understand life, he had to understand death, because you can't stop death unless you understand what causes death. So I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard was to me merely the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which, from being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for the worms. He almost sounds like a sociopath. He has no feeling. He's not afraid. He doesn't have that natural fear. Now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and carnal houses. My attention was fixed upon every object, the most insupportable to the delicacy of the human feelings. I see how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeeded to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death, and death to life, until from the midst of this darkness a sudden light broke in upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple, that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius, who had directed their inquiries toward the same science, that I alone should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. But keep in mind, he's figured out the circle of life, life and death to life, and the food, etc. But here, he's gone a little crazy. I am the one who figured it out. Now, follow this. He's talking to Walton. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman. The sun does not more certainly shine in the heavens than that which I now affirm is true. Some miracle might have produced it, yet the stages of discovery were distinct and probable. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. He doesn't bring the dead to life. He's able to give life to things that aren't alive. So, we shall continue chapter 4 in a moment. I want to record these at like about 30-minute intervals. So, make some notes, keep track of your characters, and I will see you on the next one.